Elite Motors, one of the most prestigious luxury car dealerships in Atlanta, exuded wealth, elegance, and exclusivity. Its gleaming showroom, lined with high-performance sports cars and opulent SUVs, was a playground for the rich and famous. But beneath its polished surface, the dealership hid a less glamorous truth, a culture tainted by bias, arrogance, and the cold pursuit of profit over people. Shaquille O'Neal, the legendary basketball icon turned savvy entrepreneur, had recently acquired the dealership. But instead of basking in his ownership, he chose an unconventional approach. Donning a disguise and driving an old, battered SUV, Shaq walked into Elite Motors not as its owner but as an ordinary customer. What he encountered behind those glass doors shocked him. A team too quick to judge, a manager blinded by assumptions, and a culture that failed to reflect his core values of respect and fairness. Determined to uncover the roots of these problems, Shaq took action. From firing toxic senior staff to implementing transformative policies, his mission wasn't just to sell cars, but to rebuild the soul of the dealership. Along the way, employees like Jessica, a sharp yet flawed manager, and Chris, a young idealist, would find themselves grappling with their own growth in the face of Shaq's unwavering vision for change. But change doesn't come easy. As the hidden truths of Elite Motors unravel and deep-seated habits are challenged, the team will face a pivotal question. Can a business obsessed with luxury learn to value humanity above all else? This is a story of redemption, leadership, and the transformative power of humility. Step into the world of the hidden owner and discover how one man's quiet resolve to inspire change would forever alter the fate of a dealership and the lives of everyone within it. The automatic doors of Elite Motors slid open, and with them, the journey began. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his sprawling home office, his eyes scanning the financial reports from Elite Motors, a luxury car dealership he had recently purchased. The numbers were impressive: steady sales, high-end clientele, and a glowing reputation in Atlanta. Yet, something felt off. Reports and spreadsheets could only tell part of the story. What mattered most to Shaq was the culture, the way employees treated customers, and the values the business embodied. He leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. The former NBA superstar was no stranger to hard work and discipline, values that had propelled him from a young boy with big dreams to a basketball legend and now a successful entrepreneur. But Shaq understood something else: respect. Whether on the court or in the boardroom, respect was the foundation of every relationship and success he'd ever built. Shaq's eyes shifted to a framed photograph on his desk, showing a younger version of himself standing in front of a used car lot. He remembered those days clearly. Long before the fame, he had once been turned away from a dealership because he didn't look the part. That moment had stung, but it also fueled his determination to succeed. Now, decades later, he owned one of the most prestigious car dealerships in the region. But was it living up to the standard he believed in? Shaq decided he wouldn't find the answer in his office. He needed to see it for himself. Quietly, he devised a plan. An undercover visit, stripped of any fanfare or recognition. If his employees could treat a modest, unassuming man with fairness and dignity, he'd know the dealership was in good hands. If not, well, he'd know what needed fixing. The following morning, Shaq rummaged through his closet, pulling out an old gray blazer and a slightly wrinkled shirt. He slipped on scuffed leather shoes that had seen better days. His ensemble was completed by a pair of oversized glasses and a faded baseball cap. It was a look that spoke of modesty, far removed from the polished suits and luxury watches he typically wore. Outside, an aging SUV sat idling in his driveway. It was far from the sleek sports cars he owned, but it was perfect for his plan. Shaq climbed in, the worn leather seats creaking under his weight, and drove toward Elite Motors, his mind racing with curiosity and anticipation. As the automatic doors of Elite Motors slid open, Shaq was greeted by a burst of cool, conditioned air and the distinct scent of polished leather. The showroom gleamed under rows of LED lights, each vehicle a masterpiece of luxury and engineering. Shaq's towering frame drew immediate attention. Despite his humble attire, it was hard to ignore a 7'1" man. Yet, the glances he received weren't welcoming. Employees behind the reception desk exchanged whispers, their eyes darting toward his scuffed shoes and the beat-up SUV parked in the lot. At the center of the room, Jessica Miller stood with clipboard in hand. The sales manager was the epitome of professionalism, her black suit perfectly tailored and her heels clicking sharply against the pristine floor. She prided herself on her ability to read customers at a glance, and in her eyes, Shaq didn't fit the profile of someone worth her time. With a polite but distant smile, Jessica approached. "Good morning, sir," she said smoothly. "How can I assist you today?" Shaq returned her smile, his demeanor relaxed. "Just browsing," he replied, his deep voice calm. "Looking for something that suits me." Jessica's practiced eyes scanned him, lingering on his wrinkled blazer and worn shoes. "Of course," she said, her tone polite but laced with subtle skepticism. "We have a selection of pre-owned models that might be a better fit." Shaq nodded, hiding the flicker of disappointment that crossed his mind. He walked toward a sleek silver sports car, running his hand across its glossy surface. The car's elegance reflected under the lights, a stark contrast to his attire. "This one's beautiful," Shaq remarked. Jessica hesitated before stepping closer, her smile now strained. "It is," she replied, "but it's one of our premium models. Perhaps I can show you something more aligned with your needs." The emphasis on needs wasn't lost on Shaq. He turned to face her, his gaze calm yet piercing. "And what do you think my needs are?" Jessica froze for a moment, caught off guard. Her composure returned quickly, though her tone carried a hint of impatience. "I'm just trying to save you time, sir." "Time, huh?" Shaq said softly. He stepped back, slipping his hands into his pockets. "That's thoughtful of you." Jessica offered a tight smile and excused herself to tend to another customer, leaving Shaq standing alone. Shaq wandered the showroom, observing quietly. From the corner of his eye, he noticed other employees stealing glances and whispering. A faint chuckle reached his ears as one staff member muttered something about his old man look. It was clear to Shaq that appearances carried weight here, too much weight. He'd seen enough for the day, but his plan wasn't over. Elite Motors wasn't just any dealership. It was his dealership, and this wasn't the culture he wanted to represent. As he exited the building, Shaq reached for his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Richard," he said when the call connected, his voice calm but firm. "Meet me at the dealership. We've got a situation to address." The sun glinted off the showroom's glass facade as Shaq climbed back into his SUV. His mind was already forming a strategy. Elite Motors was about to experience a change it would never forget. The warm spring sun bathed the sleek, glassy exterior of Elite Motors as Shaq sat quietly in his aging SUV. From his position in the parking lot, he watched employees bustling inside, their movements framed by the gleaming vehicles on display. The dealership's immaculate design and polished reputation belied the troubling culture Shaq had glimpsed during his brief interaction. He couldn't shake the disheartening feeling from earlier. Jessica's subtle disdain, the appraising glances from staff, and the snickers from across the showroom lingered in his mind. It wasn't anger that gripped him but disappointment. The values he stood for, respect, fairness, and integrity, seemed absent here. Inside the dealership, Jessica leaned against the counter at the reception desk, flipping through her clipboard. She chatted with two other employees, their conversation punctuated by bursts of low laughter. Occasionally, their eyes flicked toward the showroom floor, where Shaq had been moments ago. "Can you believe that guy?" one of them muttered, barely suppressing a grin. "Wearing those shoes and thinking he belongs here." Jessica smirked, but her response was measured. "You'd think people would know their limits before walking into a place like this. Honestly, he's wasting our time." Another employee, a younger man named Chris, overheard the conversation from a nearby desk. Unlike his colleagues, Chris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had only been working at Elite Motors for a few months, but the behavior of some senior staff unsettled him. Chris believed in treating every customer with respect, yet he'd witnessed enough instances of casual disrespect to know it wasn't the norm here. As Shaq stepped back into the showroom, he deliberately slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't just observing the cars, he was observing the people. Employees avoided eye contact, their focus shifting when they noticed his towering presence. Shaq approached another vehicle, a black luxury sedan, and admired its sleek design. His fingers lightly grazed the polished surface, drawing a subtle but sharp reaction from an employee passing by. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, his tone clipped. "We ask customers not to touch the vehicles unless they're serious about purchasing." Shaq looked up, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Serious about purchasing," he repeated, his deep voice calm. "Good to know." The employee offered a tight smile and walked away, muttering something under his breath. From behind the reception desk, Jessica watched the interaction with folded arms. "Why is he still here?" she whispered to one of her colleagues. "Maybe he's lost," they joked, eliciting a quiet chuckle. Shaq's patience didn't waver. He continued walking the showroom floor, keenly aware of the whispers and sideways glances following him. At one point, he paused near the reception desk, where Jessica stood. "Excuse me," Shaq said, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. Jessica turned, her polite smile appearing again, though her eyes betrayed impatience. "Yes?" Shaq gestured toward a sleek red convertible parked nearby. "Can you tell me about that one?" Jessica hesitated for a moment, then walked over, clipboard in hand. "That's one of our top-tier models," she said, her tone overly rehearsed. "Customizable interiors, high-performance engine, and a six-figure price tag. I can show you the financing options if you're interested." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "I appreciate that, but you assume I'd need financing?" Her practiced smile faltered. "I just meant, most customers prefer to explore all their options." Shaq nodded slowly, his expression giving nothing away. "Good to know," he said again. Jessica exhaled softly as Shaq moved away. She turned to a coworker, her voice dropping. "He's playing games," she muttered. An hour later, Shaq exited the dealership, his presence lingering in the minds of everyone who had interacted with him. Climbing into his SUV, he reached for his phone and called Richard, the regional director. "Richard," Shaq said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "we've got some issues at Elite Motors. Meet me there in an hour." "Is everything okay?" Richard asked, concern evident in his tone. Back inside, Chris, the young employee, found himself lingering near Jessica and the others. He hesitated, then finally spoke up. "I think we should treat everyone the same, you know? You never really know who someone might be." Jessica raised an eyebrow, her polished demeanor shifting slightly. "Chris, that's sweet, but in this business, we have to focus on serious buyers. It's just how it works." Chris bit his lip but said nothing more. Across the room, another employee chuckled. "Don't worry, Chris. You'll learn the ropes soon enough." An hour later, the sleek black car of Richard Carter, the regional director, pulled into the parking lot. He strode into the dealership, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Jessica brightened immediately at the sight of him. "Mr. Carter, good to see you," she said, her voice cheerful. Richard nodded, offering a brief smile before his gaze shifted to the far end of the showroom, where Shaq was leaning casually against a desk. The moment their eyes met, Richard's smile widened. "Shaq," Richard called out warmly, striding toward him and extending a hand. "Didn't expect to see you here today." The room fell silent. Jessica's cheerful expression froze as her gaze darted between Richard and Shaq. "Thanks for coming, Richard," Shaq said, shaking his hand firmly. "Of course," Richard replied. Then, lowering his voice slightly, he added, "What's going on?" Shaq glanced around the room, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Let's just say I've got a lot to talk about." Jessica felt her stomach drop. For the first time, she truly began to wonder who the man she'd brushed off earlier might really be. The atmosphere inside Elite Motors had shifted dramatically. The once casual whispers and light laughter among the staff had been replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. Employees exchanged furtive glances, their curiosity and anxiety mounting as Richard and Shaq moved toward the back office. Jessica stood frozen, her mind racing to piece together what was happening. Who exactly was this man? And why did Richard, the powerful regional director, treat him with such deference? In the privacy of the office, Shaq gestured for Richard to take a seat. He didn't sit himself, instead standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. His tall frame and calm presence dominated the room. "Richard," Shaq began, his voice low but firm. What do you know about the culture here? Richard blinked, taken aback by the directness of the question. The culture, he repeated. Yes. How the staff treats customers. How they treat people in general, Shaq clarified, turning to face him. Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I'd say we've built a strong team. Sales are consistent, and our customer satisfaction scores are solid. Shaq's piercing gaze didn't waver. Numbers don't tell the whole story, he said. I've spent the last few hours walking around this dealership, and what I've seen is disappointing. Richard's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Shaq leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. I came here as a regular customer, dressed modestly, driving an old car, and I was dismissed, judged, and mocked. Not just by one person, but by multiple employees. Richard's expression darkened as realization dawned. You're saying... I'm saying the culture here is broken, Shaq interrupted, his voice firm. There's a deep lack of respect for people who don't fit some narrow definition of worthy. That's not the kind of business I run. Meanwhile, in the showroom, the tension continued to simmer. Jessica stood at the reception desk, flipping through her clipboard aimlessly. She could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her. Though they were careful not to say anything outright, their glances and whispered conversations were telling enough. Chris approached cautiously, his voice hesitant. Jessica, is everything okay? That guy, he seems important. Jessica shot him a look, her usual confident demeanor slipping. I don't know who he is, she admitted, her voice lower than usual. But I have a feeling we're about to find out. Back in the office, Shaq paced slowly, his voice taking on a quieter, more reflective tone. Richard, I bought this dealership because I saw potential, not just in the cars we sell, but in the people who work here. I wanted Elite Motors to be a place where anyone, no matter who they are or what they look like, could walk in and feel valued. Richard nodded, guilt flickering in his expression. I understand. I'll talk to the team. Make it clear that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable. That's a start, Shaq said, his tone firm. But it's not enough. This isn't just about fixing one or two bad habits. It's about a cultural overhaul. Richard hesitated, then asked, What are you thinking? We're going to address this head-on, Shaq replied. Gather everyone in the conference room. I'm holding a meeting, right now? Richard's eyes widened. Right now? Right now, Shaq repeated. Minutes later, the staff of Elite Motors filed into the sleek conference room. The room, with its glass walls and polished wood table, was usually a place for sales presentations and performance reviews. Today, however, it felt more like a courtroom. Jessica took a seat near the middle, her stomach churning. Chris sat near the back, his nervous energy evident as he fidgeted with a pen. The rest of the team exchanged anxious glances, the tension palpable. Shaq entered last, his calm yet commanding presence immediately silencing the room. He stood at the head of the table, his hands resting lightly on its surface. Thank you for joining me, he began, his deep voice resonating through the room. For those of you who don't know, my name is Shaquille O'Neal. I'm the owner of Elite Motors. A wave of stunned silence swept through the room. Jessica's eyes widened in shock. Chris's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the table. Shaq allowed the silence to linger before continuing. Today, I came here not as your boss, but as a customer. I wanted to see how things really operate when no one's watching. What I experienced was disappointing. His gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on each employee. I was judged based on my appearance, dismissed because of assumptions, and treated as though I didn't matter. That's not how I expect this dealership to operate. Jessica felt her cheeks burn as Shaq's words hit home. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but kept her eyes fixed on the table. Shaq straightened, his voice growing stronger. Respect, fairness, integrity. Those are the values I believe in, and those are the values I want Elite Motors to stand for. If you can't align with that, then this isn't the place for you. A few employees glanced at one another nervously. Shaq continued, his tone softening slightly. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame, but I am here to make it clear that things need to change, and that change starts today. He turned to Jessica, his expression unreadable. Jessica, You've been here a long time. You know this business inside and out. But today, your actions didn't reflect the values we need to uphold. Jessica swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I'm sorry, Mr. O'Neal, she said, her voice trembling. I made a mistake. It won't happen again. Shaq nodded, his expression softening slightly. Acknowledging your mistake is the first step, but words aren't enough. I need to see action, not just from you, but from everyone here. Shaq turned to Richard. We're implementing a customer service reform program immediately. Every single employee, from the sales team to management, including me, will participate. This isn't just about selling cars. It's about how we treat people. Richard nodded firmly. Understood. Shaq addressed the room one last time, his voice filled with quiet determination. I believe in this team. I believe we can do better. But it's up to all of us to make that happen. As Shaq exited the room, the employees sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Jessica took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew she had a lot to prove, not just to Shaq, but to herself. The conference room remained silent long after Shaq left, his words echoing in the minds of the employees. For some, his message was a wake-up call. For others, it felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. Jessica sat rigid in her chair, staring at the polished surface of the table, her thoughts racing. Her usual confidence had been shaken to its core. Chris, seated at the back, felt an odd mix of relief and unease. Shaq's words aligned with what he had always believed. Respect and fairness should be the foundation of any workplace. But he wondered if the older, more entrenched staff would embrace the changes Shaq demanded. Jessica spent the rest of the day in quiet reflection. She replayed her interactions with Shaq, cringing at the condescension in her tone and the assumptions she had made. A part of her wanted to rationalize it, to blame the pressures of sales targets or the stress of managing a team. But deep down, she knew those were just excuses. By evening, she made a decision. If Shaq was serious about transforming the culture of Elite Motors, she had to be the first to change. The next morning, the dealership buzzed with tension. Employees whispered about the impromptu meeting and Shaq's shocking revelation. The once casual camaraderie among the staff had been replaced by a cautious vigilance. Jessica arrived early, determined to set an example. She approached Chris, who was arranging brochures near the reception desk. "Chris," she said, her voice softer than usual, "can we talk for a moment?" Chris straightened, surprised. "Sure." Jessica hesitated, then said, "I owe you an apology. Yesterday, I dismissed your suggestion about treating customers equally. You were right, and I was wrong. I appreciate your perspective, and I want you to know that I'm working to do better." Chris blinked, taken aback by her sincerity. "Thank you, Jessica. That means a lot." Later that day, Shaq returned to the dealership, his unassuming SUV drawing curious glances as it rolled into the parking lot. This time, the employees were prepared. Whispers spread quickly. "He's back." Shaq stepped into the showroom, greeted by an air of cautious optimism. Jessica was the first to approach him, her demeanor respectful but genuine. "Good morning, Mr. O'Neal," she said. "Welcome back." Shaq gave her a small nod. "Good morning, Jessica. How's everything going?" "We're working on it," she replied honestly. "I've started speaking with the team about how we can improve. I'm also taking a hard look at my own approach. I want to do better." Shaq studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said finally. "Change starts at the top." Shaq spent the next few hours observing the staff. While some employees showed genuine efforts to engage with customers respectfully, others struggled to adjust their attitudes. Shaq noted every interaction, making mental notes about who seemed aligned with his vision and who might need more guidance, or a serious reality check. At one point, he watched as Chris assisted a young couple in casual attire. Unlike some of his colleagues, Chris treated them with the same enthusiasm and professionalism he would offer a high-profile client. The couple left smiling, expressing gratitude for the warm reception. Shaq approached Chris afterward. "Good job," he said simply. Chris grinned. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neal. I just try to treat everyone the way I'd want to be treated." Shaq's smile widened. "Keep that mindset. It's going to take you far." By late afternoon, Shaq called for another meeting, this time addressing smaller groups to encourage open dialogue. In Jessica's group, he asked a simple but powerful question. Why do you think this dealership got to this point? Jessica hesitated, then spoke up. I think we've been too focused on appearances, on the image we project, and the kind of customers we think we should attract. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of what really matters, treating people with respect. Shaq nodded. That's an honest answer. And it's the first step to fixing the problem. Another employee chimed in. I think a lot of us assumed that success meant catering to a certain kind of client. We didn't realize how damaging those assumptions could be. That's the danger of bias, Shaq said. It's subtle, but it can poison an entire culture if we're not careful. As the day wound down, Shaq gathered the entire team for a closing discussion. His tone was firm but encouraging. I know change isn't easy, he said. It's uncomfortable. It forces us to look in the mirror and confront things we might not like. But if we want Elite Motors to be more than just another luxury dealership, we have to do the work. He paused, letting his words sink in. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for commitment. A commitment to respect, fairness, and integrity. If you can't commit to that, this isn't the place for you. And that's okay. But if you stay, you need to be all in. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. After the meeting, Jessica approached Shaq privately. Mr. O'Neal, she began, her voice steady but humble. I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn from my mistakes. I know I have a lot to prove, but I'm ready to put in the work. Shaq regarded her thoughtfully. Acknowledging the problem is the first step, he said. Now, show me what you can do to fix it. Jessica nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just as a manager, but as a leader. The next morning, Shaq arrived early at Elite Motors, parking his aging SUV discreetly in the backlot. His goal today was to dig deeper. While the toxic culture had been laid bare, Shaq suspected there was more beneath the surface, unspoken histories and hidden dynamics that contributed to the dealership's problems. Inside, the atmosphere was palpably different. The staff moved with caution, their actions more deliberate, as if Shaq's presence lingered even when he wasn't in the room. Jessica was already at her desk, poring over reports with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Shaq approached Richard's office, knocking lightly on the door before stepping inside. Richard looked up from his laptop, his expression cautious. Morning, Shaq, Richard greeted, standing to shake his hand. Morning, Shaq replied, his tone neutral. He gestured toward the chair opposite Richard's desk. Got a few minutes? Of course, Richard said, sitting back down. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I want to know more about the team, he said. Specifically, what shaped the culture here? It didn't get this way overnight. Richard hesitated, his fingers lightly drumming on the desk. It's complicated, he said finally. Uncomplicate it for me, Shaq replied, his calm voice carrying an unmistakable edge. Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. Jessica's a good manager, he began, but she's been through a lot. About 5 years ago, there was this incident with a customer. He came in, dressed modestly, but he claimed he wanted one of our top-tier models. Jessica spent hours working with him, test drives, financing plans, the whole 9 yards. Shaq listened intently, his expression unreadable. Turns out the guy was a fraud, Richard continued. He used fake documents, bounced a deposit check, and disappeared. We didn't catch it until it was too late. The dealership lost a lot of money, and Jessica took the brunt of the blame. She's been cautious ever since, maybe too cautious. Shaq nodded slowly. And the rest of the team? What about their attitudes? Richard hesitated again. There's been a trickle-down effect. When senior staff act a certain way, it influences everyone else. Over time, small biases snowballed into something bigger. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his mind working through Richard's words. So, it's a mix of fear, complacency, and bad habits. That's a fair way to put it, Richard admitted. Shaq left Richard's office and walked toward the main floor, his gaze sweeping over the showroom. He spotted Jessica by the reception desk, speaking with a customer. Her demeanor was professional, But Shaq could see the effort in her actions. She was trying. After the customer left, Shaq approached her. "Jessica," he said, his tone inviting conversation. She looked up, her posture stiffening slightly. "Yes, Mr. O'Neal?" "Walk with me," Shaq said, gesturing toward the quieter end of the showroom. Jessica followed him, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. When they stopped near a display of sleek SUVs, Shaq turned to her. "Richard told me about what happened a few years ago," Shaq said gently. Jessica's eyes widened slightly, then she looked away, her jaw tightening. "I should have known he'd bring that up," she muttered. "I'm not here to dig up old wounds," Shaq said. "But understanding where you're coming from helps me see why things are the way they are." Jessica sighed, crossing her arms. "That incident, it was a nightmare. I felt humiliated, like I'd failed not just the dealership but myself. After that, I stopped taking chances. I started playing it safe, focusing on customers who looked like they could afford the cars. I thought it was the smart move." "And now?" Shaq asked. Jessica met his gaze, her voice steadier than before. "Now I see how wrong I was. Playing it safe didn't protect me. It made me worse. I stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as risks or rewards." Shaq nodded. "Acknowledging that takes courage," he said. "But you've got to do more than recognize the problem. You've got to change how you lead." "I'm working on it," Jessica said earnestly. "I won't let you down." Later that afternoon, Shaq turned his attention to another matter. Chris, the young employee who had impressed him earlier, had mentioned something troubling during their last conversation. Chris joined Shaq in the office, his nervousness evident. "You wanted to see me, Mr. O'Neal?" Shaq gestured for him to sit. "I want to hear more about what you said yesterday," he began. "About certain senior staff taking advantage of others." Chris hesitated, glancing at the door as if to ensure no one was listening. "Well, it's not everyone," he started. "But there's a group, some of the older salespeople and a couple of managers. They don't just judge customers. They treat some of us younger employees like we're expendable." Shaq's expression hardened. "Give me an example." Chris shifted in his seat. "There's this thing they do with commissions. If a senior salesperson steps in at the last minute to close a deal, they take credit for the whole sale, even if one of us did most of the work." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Does Richard know about this?" Chris shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. It's just, no one wants to rock the boat." Shaq thanked Chris and sent him back to the showroom, his mind racing. It was becoming clear that the dealership's issues ran deeper than customer interactions. The culture was fractured from within, and fixing it would require more than speeches and training programs. As the day ended, Shaq stood by the front doors, watching as the staff trickled out. Jessica passed by, offering him a small nod before heading to her car. Chris gave him a quick wave. The next morning, Shaq arrived at Elite Motors with a renewed focus. The previous day's conversations had confirmed his suspicions. There were cracks in the foundation of the dealership's culture that went beyond surface-level biases. If he was going to rebuild Elite Motors into the business he envisioned, he'd need to root out the deeper issues. He made his way to the main office, carrying a folder of financial records he'd requested from the accounting team. The records were thorough, detailing everything from commissions to expense reports. Shaq's years of business experience had taught him how to spot anomalies, and as he sifted through the data, patterns began to emerge. A few hours later, Richard walked into the office. His usually confident demeanor was tempered by a hint of wariness. "You wanted to see me, Shaq?" he asked, taking a seat across from him. Shaq placed the folder on the desk and leaned back in his chair, his calm gaze fixed on Richard. "We need to talk about the commission structure here," he began. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "I've been looking through the records," Shaq said, tapping the folder. "And it's clear that certain employees are manipulating the system. Younger staff are losing out on commissions they've earned because senior employees are stepping in at the last minute and claiming the deals as their own." Richard's expression darkened. "That's a strong accusation." "It's not an accusation," Shaq said firmly. "It's a fact. The numbers don't lie." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Shaq, I'm not saying it's right, but this kind of thing happens in sales. The senior staff bring in the most revenue, so sometimes they get a little leeway. It's just how the industry works." Shaq's eyes narrowed. So you're saying it's okay to exploit your own team? No, that's not what I'm saying, Richard replied quickly. I'm saying it's complicated. These senior employees have been here for years. They know how to close deals, and they've earned a certain level of trust. Shaq leaned forward, his voice calm but steely. Trust doesn't give anyone the right to take advantage of others. If this is the culture we're fostering, it stops today. Richard sighed, realizing Shaq wasn't going to back down. What do you want to do? He asked. We're going to have a meeting with the senior staff, Shaq said. I want this addressed head-on. If they're not willing to operate with integrity, they're not going to operate here at all. Later that afternoon, Shaq gathered the senior sales team in the conference room. The group consisted of 5 individuals, all seasoned employees who had been with the dealership for years. Among them was Carla, a sharp-tongued saleswoman known for her aggressive tactics, and Mark, a charismatic closer who often boasted about his numbers. Shaq entered the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. He stood at the head of the table, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath. Thank you all for being here, Shaq began. I've been looking into how things run around here, and I've found some practices that need to change, starting with the way commissions are handled. Carla crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. What's wrong with the way we do things? Shaq's gaze shifted to her, his tone unwavering. What's wrong is that junior employees are putting in the work, and you're taking credit for it. That's not leadership, it's exploitation. Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking. With all due respect, Mr. O'Neal, sales is a competitive business. If someone can't close a deal, that's on them. Shaq's voice sharpened. It's not about competition. It's about fairness. A good leader doesn't step on their team to get ahead. They lift them up. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Shaq let his words sink in before continuing. This isn't just about money, he said. It's about creating a culture of respect and integrity. If you can't operate within those principles, this isn't the place for you. Carla scoffed. You really think you can run a dealership on fairness? Good luck with that. Shaq's calm demeanor didn't waver. We'll see, he said simply. After the meeting, Shaq called Richard into his office. Carla and Mark are going to be a problem, Shaq said. They're too entrenched in their ways to embrace the changes we're making. Richard nodded reluctantly. I've had issues with them before, but they've always brought in big numbers. Letting them go would be risky. Shaq's gaze hardened. The bigger risk is keeping them here and letting their toxicity spread. If they can't change, they're out. Period. Richard sighed, but he didn't argue. Understood. The next day, Shaq called Chris into his office. The young employee was visibly nervous, but tried to mask it with a polite smile. Chris, I've been hearing good things about you, Shaq said, gesturing for him to sit. Thank you, Mr. O'Neal, Chris replied, his voice uncertain. You've shown a lot of integrity and respect for your coworkers and customers, Shaq continued. That's exactly the kind of attitude we need here. So I'm giving you a new opportunity. I want you to help me lead the charge on improving our culture. Chris's eyes widened. Me? But I'm just starting out. That's exactly why I'm choosing you, Shaq said with a smile. You haven't been here long enough to pick up bad habits. You can set an example for others. Chris nodded slowly, his confidence growing. I'll do my best, Mr. O'Neal. I know you will, Shaq said. By the end of the week, Carla and Mark were gone, their dismissals sending shockwaves through the dealership. Shaq's decisive actions made it clear that the old ways of doing business were no longer acceptable. The rest of the team began to adapt, inspired by Chris's example and Shaq's unwavering commitment to change. Slowly but surely, the culture at Elite Motors started to shift. The morning sun poured through the glass facade of Elite Motors, casting a warm glow over the polished showroom floor. A sense of cautious optimism hung in the air. Shaq's decisive actions, letting go of senior staff like Carla and Mark, promoting Chris, and mandating a cultural overhaul, had sent a clear message to the team. Change wasn't just an option. It was a necessity. Jessica stood by the reception desk, her clipboard in hand. She had thrown herself into her work with a newfound sense of purpose. Today, however, would test her commitment to the changes Shaq demanded. A modestly dressed woman in her late 50s walked through the showroom doors. She wore a plain floral blouse and carried a weathered handbag. Her demeanor was reserved, her curious eyes scanning the rows of luxury cars with a mix of awe and hesitation. Jessica noticed her immediately. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and approached with a warm smile. "Good morning, ma'am," Jessica greeted her. "Welcome to Elite Motors. How can I assist you today?" The woman seemed surprised by the friendly tone. "Oh, I'm just looking," she said softly. "I don't think I could afford anything here, but these cars are so beautiful." Jessica's smile didn't falter. "They are beautiful," she agreed, "but you might be surprised by the options we have. May I show you around?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that. Thank you." Shaq, who had been observing from his office upstairs, watched the interaction closely. The woman was no ordinary customer. She was a close friend of Shaq's, brought in to act as a mystery shopper and evaluate the team's progress. As Jessica guided the woman through the showroom, she explained the features of several vehicles with genuine enthusiasm. She didn't make assumptions or steer the conversation toward cheaper models. Instead, she listened attentively to the woman's questions and offered thoughtful recommendations. "Would you like to take this one for a test drive?" Jessica asked, gesturing toward a sleek silver sedan. The woman looked surprised. "Really? You'd let me?" "Of course," Jessica replied warmly. "I'll grab the keys." From upstairs, Shaq smiled faintly. Jessica was passing the test, but he wanted to see how the rest of the team would handle the situation. He made his way down to the showroom floor, blending into the background as he observed. Chris was assisting another customer, a young couple browsing for their first luxury car. His tone was respectful and professional, treating the couple as valued clients regardless of their youthful appearance. Shaq nodded approvingly. However, not all interactions were flawless. One junior employee, clearly flustered by a demanding customer, struggled to maintain their composure. Shaq made a mental note to address it later in a training session. Jessica returned with the keys, handing them to the woman. "Take your time," she said. "I'll ride along and answer any questions you have." The woman beamed. "Thank you. That's so kind of you." As they headed out for the test drive, Shaq approached Chris, who had just wrapped up his sale. "Chris," Shaq said, clapping him on the shoulder, "you're doing a great job out here." Chris grinned. "Thanks, Mr. O'Neal. I'm just trying to follow your lead." "Keep it up," Shaq replied. "You're setting an example for everyone." When Jessica and the mystery shopper returned, the woman was all smiles. "Thank you so much," she said. "You've been incredibly kind and patient. If I ever do decide to buy, I'll come back here." Jessica's smile was genuine. "It was my pleasure. We'd love to help you whenever you're ready." After the woman left, Shaq approached Jessica, his expression unreadable. "Jessica," he said. She turned to face him, her posture straightening. "Yes, Mr. O'Neal?" "I saw how you handled that customer," Shaq said. "You treated her with respect and care, no matter what you assumed about her budget. That's exactly what I want to see here." Jessica's shoulders relaxed slightly, a small smile appearing on her face. "Thank you. I'm trying to do better." "You're not just trying, you're succeeding," Shaq said. "Keep it up." Later that day, Shaq gathered the team for a quick meeting on the showroom floor. He stood in the center, his towering presence commanding attention. "I've been watching how you all interact with customers today," Shaq began, "and I've seen a lot of good things. Jessica, Chris, you're leading the way, and I appreciate that." Jessica and Chris exchanged a glance, both feeling a swell of pride. "But," Shaq continued, his tone sharpening slightly, "we're not perfect yet. There's still room to grow. Some of you are struggling to adjust, and that's okay. Change takes time. What matters is that you stay committed to the process." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Remember, it's not just about selling cars. It's about creating an experience that makes people feel valued. If we can do that, we'll be successful, not just as a business, but as a team." The employees nodded, a renewed sense of purpose settling over the group. That evening, Shaq reflected on the day's progress. Jessica had risen to the challenge, Chris was thriving in his new role, and even the more hesitant employees were beginning to show signs of change. It wasn't a perfect day, but it was a step forward. As the sun set over Elite Motors, Shaq felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, He truly believed they were heading in the right direction. The sun rose over Elite Motors, its light spilling through the glass showroom windows. Inside, the energy was different, brighter, more purposeful. The cultural shift Shaq had been working toward was starting to take root. Employees were engaging with customers more thoughtfully, and the once tense atmosphere was easing into something closer to camaraderie. Shaq arrived early, as he often did now, dressed in his signature understated style. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter for the dealership, the launch of a comprehensive customer service training program designed to reinforce the values of respect, fairness, and professionalism. In the conference room, the entire staff gathered around the sleek glass table. Jessica sat near the front, her notebook open and her posture attentive. Chris was beside her, his youthful enthusiasm evident as he chatted quietly with a colleague. Shaq stood at the head of the table, flanked by a projector screen displaying the words, "Elite Motors, a new standard of excellence." "Good morning, everyone," Shaq began, his deep voice commanding the room's attention. "Today, we're taking the next step in transforming this dealership. Over the past few weeks, we've identified the issues holding us back, and we've started making changes. But now, it's time to cement those changes into the foundation of who we are." He clicked a button on the remote, and the screen shifted to a list of core values: respect, integrity, and service. "These three principles will guide everything we do," Shaq continued. "They're not just words on a screen, they're commitments. Commitments to our customers, to each other, and to ourselves." The training kicked off with interactive workshops led by an outside consultant Shaq had brought in, a seasoned expert in customer relations named Naomi Pierce. Naomi's approach was engaging and relatable, using real-world scenarios to challenge the staff's assumptions and encourage empathy. One exercise involved role-playing, where employees took turns acting as customers while others practiced handling different situations. "Jessica," Naomi called, smiling warmly. "You're up next." Jessica stood, smoothing her blazer. She had been dreading this moment, but knew it was important. Naomi handed her a scenario card, a customer who feels intimidated by the high prices. Jessica read the card, then turned to her customer, Chris, who played the role with an exaggerated nervousness. "Hi there," Jessica began, her tone warm and inviting. "Welcome to Elite Motors. I know the cars here can feel a bit out of reach, but we have options to suit a variety of needs. Let me show you some models that might work for you." Naomi nodded approvingly. "Great start, Jessica. Now, what if Chris says he's just looking and isn't ready to buy?" Jessica thought for a moment. "I'd say, that's completely fine. I'm here to answer any questions you have, whether you're ready to buy today or just exploring." "Well done," Naomi said, clapping lightly. "That's the kind of empathy and professionalism we're aiming for." By the afternoon, the team was energized, buoyed by the collaborative exercises and the positive feedback. During a break, Shaq moved around the room, stopping to chat with employees individually. He approached Jessica, who was jotting down notes. "How's it going?" he asked. "It's challenging," Jessica admitted, "but it's exactly what we need. The exercises really make you think about how you interact with people." Shaq smiled. "Good. Growth doesn't happen in your comfort zone." In the second half of the day, Shaq took the lead, sharing personal stories about respect and perseverance. "When I was younger," he began, "I walked into a dealership just like this one, hoping to buy my first car. I didn't look the part. Baggy clothes, no expensive watch. And you know what they told me? They said I couldn't afford to be there. That experience stuck with me. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because it taught me the kind of leader I wanted to be someday." The room was silent, every employee hanging on his words. "I don't want anyone to leave this dealership feeling like I did that day," Shaq continued. "That's why this matters. It's not just about selling cars. It's about treating people with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from." The training concluded with a brainstorming session where employees shared ideas for improving the customer experience. Chris suggested creating a follow-up system to ensure customers felt valued after their visits. Jessica proposed implementing small hospitality touches, like offering coffee or water upon arrival. Shaq was impressed. "These are great ideas," he said. "We'll start rolling them out immediately." Over the next week, the changes began to take shape. A hospitality station was set up near the entrance, stocked with refreshments. Follow-up emails and thank you notes became standard practice. Employees took turns role-playing during downtime to keep their skills sharp. Shaq made a point to be on the showroom floor daily, observing interactions and offering guidance. His presence wasn't just a reminder of his authority. It was a symbol of his commitment to the team and their shared vision. One afternoon, Shaq noticed Jessica assisting a customer who was clearly overwhelmed by the options. She guided them patiently, breaking down features and pricing in a way that made the process feel approachable. When the customer left smiling, Jessica turned and caught Shaq's approving nod. "You're leading by example," Shaq said as he approached her. "That's what this place needs." Jessica smiled, a mix of pride and gratitude lighting her face. "Thank you. I'm starting to see how much of a difference this can make, not just for the customers, but for us too." By the end of the month, Elite Motors was beginning to feel like a different place. Sales were steady, but more importantly, the team was unified around a shared purpose. Shaq called another meeting, this time to celebrate their progress. Standing at the head of the table, he looked out at the team, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We're not done," he said. "There's always room to grow. But what we've accomplished in the past few weeks is incredible. You've shown me what this dealership can be, what we will be, and I couldn't be prouder to be part of this team." The employees erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the conference room. For the first time, the applause wasn't just for Shaq. It was for all of them. The warm glow of a late afternoon sun illuminated the sleek vehicles displayed across the Elite Motors showroom. The dealership buzzed with activity, but this energy felt different, less tense, more collaborative. Customers moved through the space, welcomed by genuine smiles and engaged conversations. Jessica stood by the reception desk, reviewing a client file. Her confidence was no longer a facade but a reflection of the meaningful progress she had made. Her interactions with Shaq, the training sessions, and her personal growth had transformed her into a leader who inspired others. Midway through the day, a woman entered the dealership, her movements tentative. She appeared to be in her early 40s, wearing a simple cardigan and carrying a worn tote bag. Jessica noticed her immediately and stepped forward with her signature warm smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Jessica greeted. "Welcome to Elite Motors. How can I help you today?" The woman hesitated, looking around the showroom as though unsure she belonged there. "I'm just looking," she said softly. "That's wonderful," Jessica replied. "Take your time. If you'd like, I can show you some models that might interest you." The woman smiled faintly. "Thank you. That would be nice." As Jessica guided her through the showroom, they began to chat. The woman introduced herself as Claire and explained that she was a single mother who had saved for years to afford a reliable car. "I know these cars are probably out of my budget," Claire admitted, her voice tinged with embarrassment, "but I thought it wouldn't hurt to look." Jessica's heart softened. "You'd be surprised by what we can do to make things work for you," she said. "Our goal is to help every customer find something that fits their needs." They stopped in front of a sleek SUV, and Jessica described its features in detail, careful to emphasize practicality and value. Claire's eyes lit up as she imagined herself behind the wheel. From his office upstairs, Shaq watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction. Claire wasn't just any customer. She was a returning one. Years earlier, under different management, she had been treated poorly and left feeling humiliated. Shaq had personally invited her back to experience the new Elite Motors. Shaq descended to the showroom floor, observing as Jessica continued to assist Claire with patience and kindness. When Claire hesitated about financing, Jessica walked her through the options without pressure, ensuring she felt empowered to make the right decision. As Claire finalized the paperwork for her new SUV, she turned to Jessica, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never expected to feel this welcome in a place like this," she said. "Thank you for treating me with respect." Jessica smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "It's my pleasure, Claire. You deserve this." After Claire drove away in her new car, Shaq approached Jessica. "Great work today," he said. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neal," Jessica replied, still glowing from the positive interaction. "You didn't just sell a car," Shaq continued. "You restored someone's faith in this dealership and in themselves." Jessica nodded, her voice steady. That means more to me than any sale. Meanwhile, the rest of the staff had also begun embracing the dealership's new culture. Chris, now thriving in his leadership role, implemented a customer feedback system that allowed the team to continually improve their service. One customer wrote, "This is the first dealership I've been to where I felt like a person, not just a paycheck. You've earned my loyalty." Shaq read the feedback aloud during a team meeting, his pride evident. "This is what we're building here," he said. "A place where people feel valued." The ripple effects of the transformation were beginning to show. Sales increased steadily, but more importantly, customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. Employees felt a renewed sense of purpose, their efforts recognized and appreciated. Jessica, in particular, had become a beacon of the new Elite Motors. Her turnaround inspired her colleagues, many of whom sought her advice on how to improve their own interactions. Toward the end of the day, Shaq gathered the team in the conference room for a reflection session. He stood at the head of the table, his calm yet commanding presence filling the space. "I want to share a story with you," Shaq began. "A few years ago, there was a young man who walked into a dealership looking for his first car. He didn't have much money and didn't look the part, but he had a dream. Instead of being treated with respect, he was laughed at and sent away." The room fell silent, the weight of the story settling over the team. "That young man was me," Shaq said, his voice steady. "And that experience shaped the way I see the world. It taught me that success isn't just about money, it's about how we treat people." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "What we're doing here is more than selling cars. We're changing lives. We're building trust. And that's something no number can measure." As the meeting ended, the team left the conference room feeling inspired. Jessica lingered, catching Shaq before he exited. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, "thank you for believing in me, for giving me the chance to change." Shaq smiled. "You earned it, Jessica. And now you're helping others do the same. That's what leadership is about." Jessica nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. That night, as the lights dimmed in the showroom, Shaq stood by the entrance, watching the team finish their work. The transformation of Elite Motors wasn't complete, but it was well underway. For the first time, Shaq felt confident that the dealership was on the path to becoming the symbol of respect, fairness, and excellence he had always envisioned. The sun broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow on the sleek glass facade of Elite Motors. Inside, the dealership buzzed with life. Employees moved with confidence and purpose, engaging customers with a sense of pride that had taken months to cultivate. Elite Motors was no longer just a luxury car dealership. It had become a symbol of respect, fairness, and excellence. Shaq stood by the large glass windows in his understated suit, watching the morning activity unfold. For months, he had poured his time and energy into transforming the culture of this dealership. Now, as he observed the team in action, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. Jessica arrived early, as she often did now. Her transformation had been one of the most remarkable aspects of Elite Motors' journey. No longer defined by her initial mistakes, she had emerged as a leader who inspired others with her humility and dedication. As she organized her workspace, Shaq approached her. "Jessica," he said, his deep voice warm, "how are things this morning?" "Busy, but in the best way," she replied, a smile lighting up her face. "We've got 3 appointments lined up, and the team is ready." Shaq nodded. "I've been watching. You've built something special here. It's not just me anymore. This team is thriving because of the work you've done." Jessica's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neal. I couldn't have done it without your guidance." As the day unfolded, Shaq moved through the showroom, interacting with employees and customers alike. He stopped to speak with Chris, who had taken to his new leadership role with ease. "Chris," Shaq said, clapping him on the shoulder, "how's the follow-up system working out?" "It's been a game changer," Chris replied enthusiastically. "Customers love that we check in with them after their purchase. It shows them we care about more than just the sale." Shaq grinned. "That's what I like to hear. Keep it up." Midday, a returning customer walked through the doors. It was Claire, the woman Jessica had helped weeks ago. She carried a bouquet of flowers and a card. Jessica approached her with a curious smile. "Claire, what brings you back?" Claire held out the flowers. I just wanted to thank you again. That car has made such a difference in my life. I've never been treated with so much kindness and respect at a dealership. You didn't just sell me a car. You gave me confidence." Jessica's eyes glistened as she accepted the bouquet. "That means more than I can say. Thank you for coming back to tell me." Shaq, observing from a distance, felt a swell of pride. Moments like this were the real measure of Elite Motors' success. Later that afternoon, Shaq gathered the entire team in the conference room for what would be his final meeting with them in this chapter of their journey. The room, filled with familiar faces, radiated energy and optimism. Standing at the head of the table, Shaq clasped his hands together and began. "When I first came here, I saw potential," he said. "Not just in the dealership, but in all of you. I saw a team that could be better, that could lead by example, that could set a standard of excellence, not just in sales, but in how we treat people." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "Over the past few months, you've proven me right. You've embraced change, faced challenges head-on, and shown what it means to operate with respect, integrity, and service. And because of that, Elite Motors isn't just a dealership, it's a symbol." The room erupted in applause, but Shaq raised a hand to quiet them. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations," he continued. "It's time for you to take the reins. Jessica, Chris, and the rest of you. You've got what it takes to keep this place thriving. I believe in you." Jessica and Chris exchanged a look of determination, both feeling the weight of the responsibility, but also the confidence Shaq had instilled in them. As the meeting ended, Shaq stood near the entrance, shaking hands with each employee as they left. When Jessica reached him, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neal, for everything. We'll make you proud." "You already have," Shaq replied with a smile. That evening, as the showroom lights dimmed, Shaq lingered for a moment, taking in the quiet space. This dealership was no longer just a business. It was a testament to what could be achieved when people committed to treating others with respect and fairness. As he walked out the door, the last rays of sunlight casting a golden hue over the parking lot, Shaq felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Elite Motors wasn't just a success story, it was a legacy. And for Shaq, it was proof that true leadership wasn't about power or profit. It was about uplifting others, building trust, and leaving a lasting impact.